Welcome back. And so, what we're looking at today is the 1990 first round matchup between Chicago and Minnesota. So, the interesting thing is this 1990, of course, we see the Edmonton Oilers eventually knock out the Chicago Blackhawks in the conference finals. Edmonton wins their last Stanley Cup. And this is really a series that's interesting for the fact that in 91, the Minnesota North Stars would go all the way to the Stanley Cup finals. In 92, the Chicago Blackhawks go all the way to the Stanley Cup finals. And in 1990, we start to see the Captain Hook treatment with Chicago goaltending in the playoffs. Now, Chicago came into this series with home ice. They had a 41-33-6 record, 316 goals scored. That was fifth in the NHL, 294 goals against, which was 14th. Remember, 21-team league. The Minnesota North Stars, 36-40-4, 284 goals scored, which was 15th. 291 goals against, which is 13th. So more goals allowed by Minnesota than scored. And of course, they'd have a miserable regular season the following year. But it turns out to be a pretty good playoff for them. So game one in Chicago and Minnesota does pretty well. More importantly, Brian Bellows gets off to a great start in the playoffs. Power play goal for Bellows from Modano at 9:57. 1-0 Minnesota after one, and they carry that lead after the second as well. Third period, power play goal by Denny Savard from Brown and Creighton at 5:01, and then Bellows scores from Neil Broughton at 5:54. Both Neil and Aaron Broughton are members of the North Stars at this point. Shane Churla had 10 penalty minutes in that game. I'm tracking penalty minutes because these teams really fought it out a lot in this series. Casey, 30 saves on 31 shots. And Greg Millen, 24 saves on 26 shots, and what was a pretty good goaltending matchup in game one. Game two, Minnesota roars out. First, it's a power play goal by Bellows from Dahlin and Murphy at 8:49. Chambers then scores on the power play from Gagne and Aaron Broughton at 10:41, and then a little more than 1 minute later, it is Neil Broughton on a power play scoring from Dahlin and Barber at 11:56. So it's 3-0. But before that period's out, it's a power play marker for Chicago. Presley scores from Manson and Brown at 14:24. But it's 3-1 Minnesota going into the second period. Looks like they could come out of Chicago with a 2-0 series lead. But second period, Gilbert scores from Steve Thomas and Jocelyn Lemieux at 1:49. And then it's a power play goal for Roenick from Bob Murray and Steve Larmer at 3:53. And then Thomas scores on the power play from Bob Murray and Doug Wilson at 7:27. So that is a total of 6 out of 7 goals there that are scored on the power play. And then it's a shorthanded marker, Wayne Presley from Jocelyn Lemieux at 16:39. That makes it 5-3 Chicago after 2. And in the third period, they ride that home. Wilkinson had a fight with Creighton in that game. Larry Murphy had a 5-minute high sticking penalty, so that means a game misconduct. And he ended up with a grand total of 23 minutes in penalties in that game. So Larry Murphy, not one of Chicago's favorite people coming out of that game. Casey saved 26 out of 31. Greg Millen, he saved 2 out of 5. He gets replaced. Ed Belfour goes in, saves 15 out of 15. This game featured 183 minutes in penalties. Yeah, that's a lot of penalty minutes in one game. So we go into the next game in Minnesota, and Chicago does what Minnesota did. They assert themselves on the road. A little bit of a different route to get there. No scoring in the first, also no scoring in the second, and then in the third, a little past the halfway mark, Steve Larmer scores from Gilbert and Savard at 10:12, and then Presley adds another goal from Thomas and Creighton at 15:27. Modano would score in the last minute of the third period from Gagne and Dahlin at 19:24, but that is as close as Minnesota gets. They lose 2-1 in Game 3 at home. Keith Brown had 12 penalty minutes for Chicago. Mark Tenorti had 14 penalty minutes for Minnesota. Greg Millen saves 31 out of 32, and John Casey, 27 saves on 29 shots for Minnesota. So again, that's your second big goaltending matchup in this series. Wouldn't stay that way throughout the series, though. So game 4, Minnesota needs a big game. They have to have a big game, or they're going to be down 3-1 going back to Chicago. So what happens is Don Barber scores in the first period from Gagne and Chambers at 4:24. Barber scores again, this time on the power play from Wilkinson and Aaron Broughton at 11:41. And in the second period, McRae with a goal. McRae and Churla, both for Minnesota. This was a tough team. Neil Broughton with the assist at 7:42. That made it 3-0. And in the third period, Dave Gagne adds another one for good measure from Barber and Bellows at 3:41. So Don Barber with 2 goals and an assist in this game. I remember thinking this kid's going to be great. And then, all right. Dwayne Sutter, 12 penalty minutes in this game, and Basil McRae with 10 penalty minutes for Minnesota to go with his goal. Millen had 10 saves on 12 shots, replaced by Belfour, who saved 26 out of 28, and John Casey saved all 29 shots he faced for the only shutout in this series, as Casey continued to warm my heart. I liked John Casey a lot when he was in Minnesota. So we go to Game 5 in Chicago. And this logo is the same one as that Chicago logo for Game 5 on the board. Definitely intentional on my part. First period power play goal, it's Jeremy Roenick scoring from Wilson and Savard at 10:17. And then Savard scores from Yanni and Larmer at 13:26. So it's 2-0 Chicago after 1. Second period, Gilbert scores from Troy Murray and Jocelyn Lemieux at 4:53 to make it 3-0. A power play marker by Bellows makes it 3-1 at 9:24. But after 2, Chicago's in control. So, third period, Michel Goulet scores from Savard and Larmer at 16:37. And then about a minute later, Thomas scores from Presley and Roenick at 17:48. And it's a slaughter. So now Minnesota has to win 2 in a row if they're going to stay in this series. Dwayne Sutter, 15 penalty minutes in that game. And that's after he had 12 in this one. Casey, 31 saves on 36 shots. Millen saved 26 out of 27. And the Chicago Blackhawks, like I said, on the verge of knocking out Minnesota. But in Game 6 in Minnesota, the North Stars, they show that fight. And this is one thing, I mentioned with Toronto when I talked about the Toronto series not that long ago, that no matter how bad Toronto's record was in the 80s, you could count on a fight from Toronto in the playoffs. Minnesota in this era, kind of the same thing. Regular season, they might just be crap. But during the postseason, not too shabby. So Chambers scores from Aaron Broughton and Stu Gavin at 10:28 to make it 1-0 Minnesota. Gilbert would answer about 2 minutes later from Creighton and Troy Murray at 12:33. And then Berezan scores to make it 2-1 from Wilkinson and Giles at 17:25. And then a little over a minute later, Neil Broughton scores from Gavin and Aaron Broughton at 18:48. So both Broughtons combine on that one. Second period, Minnesota keeps it up. Larry Murphy scores from Bellows and Barber at 1:26. Quick, trade that Larry Murphy away. Anyways. Power play goal then by Gagne from Aaron Broughton and Dolan at 14:20. Never liked the idea of trading Larry Murphy. That drove me nuts. Third period, Chicago does stage a comeback. First, it's a shorthanded goal for Steve Larmer from Conroyd at 12:57. Then Roenick scores from Savard and Thomas 1 minute later at 13:57. But that's as close as they get. Minnesota holds the fort. They win 5-3 and they force a Game 7. Manson had 14 penalty minutes in this one. Stu Gavin had 12 penalty minutes for Minnesota. Yeah, Manson was in this series. This was a very physical series. These teams really didn't like each other, and there were a lot of penalty minutes in it because that's the way that works. Greg Millen saves 7 out of 10. Belfour goes in, saves 31 out of 33. And Casey, he saved 27 out of 30. So let's see. How many times does Captain Hook get employed in this series? 1, 2, 3 times. You see the goaltender get changed. In every game lost by Chicago, they end up changing goalies. So we go to Game 7. Is Minnesota going to force the goaltender out again? No. And it goes back to Greg Millen. And I'll say this much. When you look at the stats, you would think he'd go with Belfour. But he goes with Millen. And this is how it works sometimes. Sometimes it works out really, really well. Minnesota, though, would score in the first. It's Barber from Bellows. That's a power play marker at 9:02 to make it 1-0 Minnesota. They hold that lead after the first. But in the second, it all falls apart, and it's Presley. Presley was a big playoff guy for Chicago, too. Scores from Sutter at 3 minutes, and then he scores again from Creighton and Thomas at 4:06. And once it became 2-0, I, as a North Stars fan, went, and that's probably going to be it. Roenick then scores from Goulet and Larmer at 12:41. Roenick scores again from Larmer and Thomas at 14:06. It is 4-1 for Chicago after 2. Third period, Minnesota would get on the board again. It's Dolan from Murphy and Tenorti at 9:58, but Gilbert, last nail in the coffin, from Murray and Lemieux at 17:10, and Chicago wins the game 5-2. Gagne, 10 penalty minutes. Both Brown and Savard had 15 penalty minutes in this game. John Casey, 28 saves on 33 shots. And Greg Millen, 30 saves on 32 shots for the Chicago Blackhawks. So again, all 4 wins for Chicago. Millen here, Millen here, Millen here, and then this one here. Actually, no, they didn't pull their goalie in that loss. Sorry, I got that wrong. This one here, they pull their goalie in a win, and they end up coming back for the victory, and Belfour gets credit for the win. This one, of course, Millen gets the win. So 3 wins for Millen, 1 win for Belfour. And yet the overall numbers tell you maybe he should have gone with Belfour, but all right. Larmer had 2 goals, 5 assists. Steve Thomas, 2 goals and 5 assists. Presley, 5 goals and a helper. Roenick, 5 goals and an assist. Savard, 2 goals, 4 assists. Millen was 3-2 with a .903 save percentage. Belfour was 1-1 with a .947 save percentage in this series. Yeah, not too shabby. On the Minnesota side, Bellows, 4 goals, 3 assists. Barber had 3 goals and 3 assists. Again, I thought Don Barber was going to be a great player. Gagne, 2 goals, 3 assists. Dahlin, a goal and 4 assists. Aaron Broughton had 5 assists. And Neil Broughton had 2 goals and 2 assists for the Minnesota North Stars. Casey, 3-4 with a .904 save percentage in the series. And I was a fan coming out of that series as well. Penalty minutes in the series where Minnesota actually outshoots Chicago 220 to 219, showing how close this series was. But when you get the lopsided scores in Chicago's favor, it kind of makes things look worse than what they were. Savard, 27 penalty minutes. Creighton, 39. Keith Brown, 37. Manson had 34. Sutter had 35. And Wayne Van Dorp had 23. On the Minnesota side, Larry Murphy had 31, 23 in that one game. McRae had 24, and Shane Churla had 44 penalty minutes. So he led the series in penalty minutes. Chicago had 294 penalty minutes over 7 games. Minnesota had 252. And so there was a lot of game misconducts in there and a lot of chippy play between two teams that really didn't like each other. And what's interesting with this, too, is that this is at a time where when Minnesota would play St. Louis, the series were relatively clean. But against Chicago, that's when the knives come out. So one of those weird things. And I thought this was an interesting series to look at from 1990. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And hey, thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.